record. Okay. So just to dive in, I think a lot of you guys have been to our other events, but essentially what I'm going to do is run through a bunch of slides hyper fast and then open it up to Q&A. There's so much content on these slides, and I'm not going to read it to you because you guys are more than capable of reading. So please go back and look at it later. There's a lot of like kind of thought questions for you to think about yourself that, do on your own time. I wanted to include this meme on the first slide because at least my experience with applying was like, I really never knew what I was doing at any point. And, I'm hoping the other mentors kind of felt the same. It was just, there were so many decision points down to like, do I include an exclamation point or a period at the end of the sentence to this email to this professor? Like so many things you're like, is this going to be the difference that makes or breaks my chances of getting into grad school? And you just need to be like, you know what, it's fine. I'm doing really well. I've worked very hard to get here. It's going to be great. And so try to be a little bit more like Andy Dwyer as you're going through this process. And as always, there are links to our drive, which has a lot of good stuff. Okay, so this whole process of applying to grad school is like a really long process. We're really only going to be talking about this first bit right up until you submit your applications. We do have sessions, and we'll have a session in December and January for the phone interview and the interviews. So keep an eye out for that. And then we will also have something on rejection in case that's something that you experience this cycle. So just kind of giving you a preview. I cannot do that. Okay. So something I wanted to talk about that's kind of associated with applications, but not directly involved in this process. And for me, this was something I did before, like well before applying. So I just kind of want to put on your radar. The standardized tests that are required take a lot of time to prep for, and they can be really expensive. So if you are applying this cycle and you have not taken the GRE yet, or not taken the psych subject test, and you think you want to, definitely do that now. If you're someone who has to take the TOEFL, if you are an international student, you have to take the TOEFL or the IELTS. I don't know how you say that. Make sure you do that now before you start diving into all this application material, or at least start putting in infrastructure to make sure that you are prepared. Now, with COVID, so many things have shifted in terms of whether or not GREs are required. The psych GREs are always kind of been like recommended, but sometimes required. It's not an easy answer to say like everyone should take the psych GRE. The psych GRE is horrendous and really horrible to study for. And I mean, I studied for like 3 months and I still didn't feel prepared. Like it was just a bad experience. So that's all to say, try to get this out of the way as soon as possible. I know it's a little bit late for me to be telling you this, but try to get this out of the way as soon as possible. If you're someone who's worried about your GPA, maybe lean into the GRE and try really hard to get a good grade there. If you're someone who, so like my primary major in undergrad was neuroscience, and I was applying to psych programs. And so taking the psych GRE was really important for me to show that like I did actually know my psych stuff, even though my degree said neuro. So if that's kind of describing you, or if you're a non-traditional student who had a career doing something else, it might be good for you to show that you actually know psych stuff. I can answer more questions about why I hated the psych GRE so much. I'm happy to rant about that later. But yeah, definitely keep this on your radar. Do this as soon as humanly possible. You do get the scores back really quickly, like 30 seconds after you finish the test, except for the writing portions. But it's not like the SAT where there's like a month. So that's nice. And, in case you have to retake it, you want to take it in enough time so you have time to retake it before you have to submit your scores. I think we'll talk with Karina a little bit later about her experience with, what they did with the GRE for this past cycle. I have literally no idea what they're going to do with the GRE next cycle. I don't think anyone knows. So that puts you guys at a disadvantage because I really can't tell you what to do. I'm sorry. But definitely try to fit this in your schedule as soon as possible. Okay. So I have like a whole list of steps. And like I said before, there's a lot of content on these slides. So I don't expect you guys to like totally comprehend everything that's on the slides right now. But there are some things you need to think about before you start this process. And so you need to work through your priorities now. It's a lot easier to come up with your priority list now and then apply to places that fit your priorities. Because otherwise you're going to end up wasting money applying to like your dream school that's in a terrible area that you don't want to live in, or your dream school, but your partner can't live there, or your dream school, but they don't actually do research you want to do. You want to have your priorities defined before you start diving into this process. So I'll talk a little bit more about defining your research interests, but that should really be your first step. And that's something, you know, I'm sure you're all sitting there like, well, yeah, of course I'm interested in schizophrenia, but like, what about schizophrenia? You need to have that question answered now instead of waiting until, you know, you're sitting in front of an interviewer. That is not the time to figure this out. There are some other things to think about now. So mentor attributes in terms of like, do you want a family style lab? Do you want an up and coming mentor that you can really like take a lead on a project, or do you want to just fit in with somebody else's work and, you know, focus on some other priorities in your life? It's something for you to think about. I have this linked here. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. This funding status goes to the NIH reporter. And this is not the be all end all source of like information on who has what grants, but it's pretty good. It's about as good as you can get. And so if you're like looking at someone and they don't have that many publications in the last 5 years, but you want like a really active lab, you can go on this website and like look them up and see if they have funding coming in from NIH, like maybe they just started a long-term project and they've been busy, that sort of thing. Definitely don't like base your whole application on the fact that they have a grant or not on this website, because like I said, it's not be all end all, but it could be a helpful resource. So that's something to think through. Definitely think about what sort of program you're looking at in terms of, this is more for clinical, but like in terms of the clinical research balance. That's something to really ponder about yourself before you start applying, because the schools are pretty rigid about what they do, and they aren't going to bend too much to fit your needs and wants. So definitely think about that now. I'm not watching the chat. Do I need to be watching the chat? Okay, cool. Thank you, Abby. So another thing to think about is this APA versus PC SAS. I think this really applies more to clinical and counseling. Definitely not relevant to developmental. So APA accredits psych programs, just psych programs. PC SAS accredits clinical science programs. And so a program that is PC SAS accredited is saying, I'm going to prioritize research at my institution, and hey, look, I'm doing a good job of it. I'm PC SAS accredited. If you are someone who, like me, I wanted to do research, that's like my priority here going into grad school, I looked at PC SAS accredited schools. As of now, as far as I know, all PC SAS schools are also APA accredited. So if you're looking at PC SAS, you don't need to be worried about like not getting on into internship. Some schools are really mad at APA because they're rigid and hard to work with. So they're threatening to drop the APA accreditation. If that's something you're worried about, talk to your school, see what, some of them have statements written on there. I think there was a UC, one of the UCs had a whole statement about it. If that's something you're worried about, they might address that. Just gonna kind of jump around. Think about your geographic needs. I mean, like, so I went to grad school with a partner and I needed to go somewhere that he could find a job. Like that was really high on my priority list. Like I knew my lifestyle, my like happiness, my mental health would be so improved if he and I were not thousands of miles apart. So I prioritized this geographic attribute. And that was just important to me. I know it's not important to everyone, but this is why you need to do some like pondering. Financial considerations. So the reality is stipends are not high. And generally the stipends are pretty consistent across schools, regardless of where they are. So that's to say that, you know, I might just be totally off my rocker, but I'm pretty sure the stipend at Columbia is about the same as the stipend at Ohio State. And the cost of living in downtown New York City and the cost of living in Ohio State, which is, I think, Columbus, I could be wrong, totally different, absolutely different cost of living. So that's something to think about if you have debt that you're trying to work off, if you have a safety net. I mean, that's a totally different conversation. So think about that now and kind of work that in. And then like I kind of previewed, are you moving with a partner? This needs to be something you talk about now. I brought my partner into the conversation super early on. He was very involved in like ranking locations. So I'll show you guys that a little bit later, but I found it was a really important conversation to have early before I dug in too much. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of dive into each of these little facets a little bit more quickly. So defining your research interests, like I kind of previewed, you guys might be interested in a disorder or a task or something, but you need to be able to articulate in like one sentence what you're interested in. And you need to be really sure of it. So this is, like I said, not the time to figure it out in January, figure it out now. And so you also need to figure out which parts are flexible and which parts aren't flexible. And so this is my like research question that I went into graduate school with, and I've kind of diagrammed it so you guys can kind of think about your stuff the same way. And so my like one sentence research question that I came up with probably in like December, I should have come up with it earlier. So like be better than me. My like one sentence research question is, what is the neural basis of maladaptive responses to stressors? Okay. I am not flexible on the neural part. I need to have this neuroscience part. That's part of my core interests. For me, the maladaptive response, that's pretty flexible in what that looks like. And so I'm presently working with individuals who self-harm, but previously I'd been working with individuals who were depressed and stress would impact their cognition. And so that's kind of the maladaptive part that I was looking at. I've just listed some other examples of like things that satisfy that maladaptive response to stress. And the stress part, again, I was pretty flexible on what that stress looked like in terms of if it's early childhood stressors, if it's just, chronic stressors, or if it's one-time stressors. So this is something that I came up with a really broad question, but this is genuinely what I'm interested in. Some of you might have a very specific question, and that's totally great. But if you find that there aren't enough mentors out there doing that research, you might want to take a step back and see which parts you're flexible on. Okay, so this is something do on your own, take some time, like an hour, like literally spend an hour, because it can be hard to like make yourself think critically about what you're interested in. So do it. Okay. Organizing your thoughts.
Kate?
Oh, go ahead.
There's a question in the chat. Some people say licensure is important, or location is important for licensure in that state. Will that be talked about further?
That's a great question.
So my response to that, and I'm going into my 4th year of a PhD program in counseling psychology. I'm at the University of Louisville. And what I would say to that is that if you can get into a program that's in a state that you want to be practicing in, that's ideal, just because their curriculum is teaching to whatever the state licensure requirements are. But it's also totally not a deal breaker to go somewhere else, because you can always go on internship to the other state, and usually what you'd have to do is maybe take some supplemental coursework or something to get licensed in another state. The most important thing is just going to be keeping track of all your syllabi and things like that when you're in your program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for jumping in. I did see another question about being too flexible, I guess. I think it's okay to say like, I'm really interested in your project and it is fitting this question of mine, and like kind of turn it back on them and be like, or maybe not turn back on them, but just kind of explain how their current projects fit into this really well, and talk about how excited you are about their projects. But yeah, I agree. That is a hard situation to be in, where you're kind of having to defend your flexibility. I don't have much more than that. So I kind of came out of the full slideshow because I have these links. I can follow up on that earlier question. I feel like I didn't answer it very well, but we can follow up on it later. Sorry. I have these links to these slideshows. It's really important for you to come up with your priorities and then like figure out what is most important. So this was, there it is. This was my like super overwhelming spreadsheet. It's a lot. And this was the ranking list is the first page. Let's go over here. This is where I had my partner ranking, like, could he get a job? Honestly. And that's what he was ranking. He's a biomedical engineer, so he's looking for biomedical engineering companies that would take somebody like him and have projects he was interested in. I was also interested in looking at like funding, mean time to completion, how clinically oriented they were. And this came from a book that I referenced later, so I will bring that back up. I personally, this is all very personal in terms of like how I rank the location. It's based on my experiences and where I've lived and what I, like in a location. So don't take this too seriously and be like, well, she ranked it a whatever, and I really like it. So hopefully I don't offend people. So yeah, this is just like a lot to look at. But essentially I worked on ranking the locations and the programs first, and then I looked at the researchers. And I believe personally that saved me a lot of time, because you can spend many hours looking at every single bio of every single faculty member ever, right? And that's just a lot. And so what I did was I only looked at the researchers at the programs that I found viable, essentially. And then I kind of cut it down to the shortened list, started looking more deeply at the researchers. And then I cut it down more to talk about who I was going to email, and I'll get into all this later. But I just wanted to preview for you that I made a template where I just deleted all my answers, and you guys can feel free to take it and do whatever you want with it. I just found that it was really important to have this like giant spreadsheet because it made me feel a little bit more in control. Do what you need to do. It's all up to you. Yeah. There are some other resources out there in our drive about how to organize it. I'll go into a little bit more about like the actual organization of my, like once I applied or once I decided where I was applying, how I organized that and what information was important to keep track of. But there are other resources on our drive, and feel free to take my template. Okay, so some program considerations. So the websites that the programs put out are just a lot of promotional fluff, and they're all like that, every single one. And so sometimes it's hard to get at like, what are their values? Sometimes they'll say their values, but like, what would it actually be like to be there? That can be really difficult. And so definitely go in with your priorities clear about, I want a small cohort. I want to be in this area. I want a program that prioritizes diversity, equity, inclusion. Like, go in with that, look for those items. Sometimes they won't be there and that doesn't mean anything, but then you can ask somebody later. If it's just not on the website, you can follow up with that later. So this like student admissions outcome and other data, I think I've picked up that based on APA, that's required. And so every single program will have this, and it has the mean or median GRE scores of admitted students, the mean time to completion, all sorts of other attributes. Sometimes it even has like the number of courses required. Don't get too bogged down in all those numbers, but I was looking at, I didn't want a program that had like crazy long times to completion. I wanted to get in, get out to some extent. They also post the match rates for internship. Those match rates for internships and the mean time to completion are very much based on the individuals who are attending the schools. And so it's kind of weird to like read into it too much, but if the means are really high for the time to completion or really low for the match rates, that is a little bit concerning. So just kind of like go in with a grain of salt. If there's like one person that took 9 years to complete a PhD, like that's probably on them. If it's like 90% are taking like 7 years, like, okay, there might be something else going on. So anyway, so they all have these websites, generally they're PDFs, sometimes they're on the websites, but they all exist. I looked at the US News rankings. A lot of people don't like the US News rankings. Essentially what the US News rankings are is like funding generally for the program, like how much funding does a school have? It definitely does not equate to quality. So that's just kind of like have that giant asterisk when you're looking at it. Yeah, so that's something I took into consideration. The funding situation, like the stipend funding situation for the students, was interesting to me. I wanted a program that had at least 4 years guaranteed, because most PhDs are going to take like 5 years. And so at least, so I kind of wanted to know going in if I was going to be like fighting to survive, fighting for funding. That was something I took into consideration. And then this is the book that I referenced earlier, The Insider's Guide to Graduate Programs. I think this links to the Amazon site. I'm sure you can get it used. I already gave mine away, so sorry, but it has a lot of information in it. It's like really, really comprehensive, actually, impressively comprehensive. So feel free to pick that up. I don't feel like there's like that much in there that you can't get off the websites, but sometimes it's nice to like have a physical book to read. I was kind of referring to it as my Bible, because I just like would flip through it every time I was feeling anxious to like look for the answer to whatever my question was. You also have mentors. That's why you're here. So you can always ask us. But yeah, so that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at these programs. Financial considerations. So like I alluded to, going to grad school is not the most lucrative thing you can do. But applying to grad school is also very expensive. And so I chose to apply to 11 schools. Some people apply, it's like 10 to 20 schools. You come up with a budget before you go into this, so you can really prioritize that if that's going to be a limitation for you. This is just my example, but this is, how much it cost me to apply. I think the biggest takeaway from this is that the application fees for different schools are very different. And so it's really hard to like anticipate, like right now, where you are right now, how much those application fees are going to be, because there's a big variety. Trying to think, yeah, these are for ordering undergrad transcripts. Most schools don't require the official ones, but some do. I think I had one school that required the official one, and so I had to buy it. Whatever.
They'll require it eventually,
yeah,
at the end, to confirm that you completed your degree, because that's kind of important.
Whatever. Yeah. And then like I talked about before, the GREs can be really expensive, and paying for those books for the GREs can be really expensive. There are free, like I think Magoosh is the free resource that everyone really likes. I use the Magoosh app. But yeah, so it can get really pricey. And I only did 11 schools. Some people do 20. So just multiply that. It's a lot. Just keep that in mind. The other thing, this doesn't include flying to interviews. I was lucky enough to drive to one of my interviews, and the other one was covered. And the other one I turned down. So that's where we're at. So this doesn't include that, because I was lucky enough to not have to pay for it, which is really unique. Like most programs make you pay to travel to get to them for interviews. I don't know what's going on for COVID. I have no idea. Can't tell the future, but just something to think about. Okay, I'm rambling. Sorry. If you can pay, or if you can apply for a fee waiver, do it. The programs, like the faculty members you're applying to, are not going to like judge you. They're probably not even going to see it. It's honestly going to go through the department administrator, and they're going to handle it. And it's never going to even go back to the faculty member if that's something you're worried about. So there is a list of some specific ones, but I think there's the need-based fee waiver is normally talked about like on the actual program website. If that's missing, there are some other places you can look. And so you would send, an email like this to like the program admin, not the program director, but the program admin. If you could probably email the program director if you really wanted to. Or you can ask the chair. Yeah, okay, anyways. Assessing DEI in schools is getting really tricky, because some places are putting out like big loud mission statements saying like, we love DEI and this is so important to us, and then they don't actually do anything. So it can be really hard to like see through the BS, I guess. My program, we have an active committee. It's absolutely not perfect, but there's nothing about it on the website. So if you are looking to apply to U of M and you're like trying to assess our DEI efforts, you couldn't tell because there's nothing about it. So this is hard to do from the websites. I don't know if you can tell, I don't really like the websites. There's not much information on them, but this is something, if it's important to you, like keep a tab in the back of your head about like, okay, this program didn't have anything on their website. I need to follow up about that later. Sometimes they do have stuff on their website. Sometimes there's like pictures of people like actually doing things, which is great. But don't count on that. And you can always like email, we'll talk about emailing later, ask about that in your faculty emails, ask about that in your grad student emails. If there's a specific issue that's important to you, reach out to the admin, reach out to your faculty member and ask about that issue too. So international student considerations. I think we'll touch on this a little bit more in the Q&A because I'm not the most experienced in this area, like literally at all. But definitely look at what information they have available and ask questions if your questions are not answered. But this whole thing about the OPT is really about talking more about the time after you graduate going to postdoc, because while you're a student, my understanding is that you're covered, but it's that like weird time after you're a student. Are you able to stay in the country? How long are you able to stay in the country? How stressful is that going to be? So this is just something to keep in mind as you're looking at. Are there in-house grants and fellowships? That's something to think about. Or are you going to be relying on like the NIH grants and fellowships, which tend to be reserved for US citizens? So lots to think about here. Okay, so I talked about thinking about your priorities, coming up with a giant list, and now you need to cut. Okay, this is hard to do because every single time you cut, you're gonna be like, that could have been the most perfect school ever. I'm gonna, screw myself over. I'm not gonna get in anywhere because I cut off that school. You just need to stick to your guns and just kind of move on. Just let it be. You're like, okay, this is not the right area for me. This is not the right type of program for me. Just move on. Once you have cut down schools, I think I had like 20 to 30. Then you start looking for mentors. At least this is what I'm telling you to do. You don't have to. Then you start looking for mentors. That'll save you a lot of time, a lot of reading of bios. And then this is just linked to my email list. So the email list was the list of mentors that I decided were at programs that were viable for me and I was interested in their work. Okay, so that has been my process. How to identify a good mentor is really hard from a website. So my current mentor, I love her, Bonnie Klein-Stugan, has a horrendous website. And I think she's aware. It has not been updated in like 10 years. All of her like recent publications are from like 2010, literally. None of her like current projects are like really up to date. None of the current team members are on there. So it can be really hard to tell on the website. The mentor websites are like perusing them and the lab websites. It's a good time to look for like red flags and green flags, I think I called them. A lot of times you can't tell much beyond like, I'm doing this project or I published on this data. But there are some like red flags. So I remember I was looking at one professor's and there was so much self-promotion. He was very obviously trying to sell his book. And I was just like, this is weird. Like he was just kind of bragging about all the awards he had won and not really like talking about his lab team family. So that's something to think about. I found a few who had like really cute posts about their like former grad students and how proud they were and look at what they're doing now. And I was like, wow, this seems like a really supportive person. The fact that some people don't have that doesn't mean that they won't be supportive in person, but just something to keep in mind. I already talked about NIH reporter. Oh, another thing to keep in mind, this is something I thought about a lot, is if there's like, you're flexible and you're inflexible, your priorities for your research question, if there's not one person there who does like a perfect fit, you might be able to do co-mentoring. I think I really was like looking for a co-mentor and it just never really ended up working out, but that's fine. That's something to keep in mind if you're like, I love this school, this is the perfect program for me. But one person's like not enough. You can negotiate that with them, probably earlier the better, in the emails you will send. Okay. Yeah, see if they have current or recent graduate students. There are some people who are like on the faculty pages that like haven't had grad students in like 10 years. So definitely look that up before you start like investing too much time into them. Okay, move on. So determining who is accepting applications. So in like October, a lot of the schools will announce who's accepting applications. However, I found this was like way too late for me. Twofold. One, like waiting until then is too late for me to start working on applications. Two, emailing the professors before then to ask if they were accepting applications gave me a foot in the door to ask them questions and to start a conversation. And so starting on this early, like this emailing thing early that I'll talk about later, before they posted actually worked out really well for me. So anyways, so in October, they'll post a list generally, not always, of who is accepting applications. That is be all end all. You can't really negotiate with that and the professors can't negotiate with that, but that's a little bit late. So you can send them an email, in September-ish asking, are you accepting, if the list isn't up. Professors are really horrendous at responding to emails, just like as a rule. So don't be like too discouraged if they don't respond. But you can follow up probably once, but maybe not 3 times. That's a little bit much. If there's no list and no response, you can ask the assistant to the director of the program. Their name will be everywhere on the website. They'll know, or they'll know who to ask. Okay, moving on. Email etiquette. So only email professors if you have like an actual reason to email them and a reason for them to respond. So it's not a rule that you must email the professors that you intend to apply to, but it just works out that like people are going to do it and get a foot in the door and start the conversation. And so you might want to consider being one of those people. So that's why I'm saying email them in like September and be like, hi, I'm really interested in your work. Are you accepting applications? Because I would love to apply to you. That's a great way to get your foot in the door. It's a really easy question for them to answer. Generally, it's a yes or a no, or an I don't know. I got a few of those, and that's fine. You can ask then about like possibility of co-mentoring. You can ask about, I'm really interested in XYZ project that you were working on 2 years ago. Are you still working on that? Would I be able to work on that data if I were your graduate student? Go in with like an actual question, not just like, hi, I'm obsessed with you, cool, bye. That's not great. They'll be like, who's this weirdo? I'm not gonna respond to them. So go in with a clear question for them. We do have example emails for you to look at. If you're only emailing for network purposes, like, hi, I just really wanted to say hi, they're going to be like, whatever, because they get thousands of emails a day. Keep your emails concise and always attach your CV, because their first follow-up question is going to be like, please send your CV. I'm like, okay, so if you like anticipate that and you have a really impressive CV or a really neat CV, they'll be like, nice, I like this person, I'll put them on my list. Sometimes they have physical lists, sometimes they just like remember people. Okay, so here's one email template. There are other email templates in the drive that you can look at on your own time. Okay, so coming up with the application materials can be really overwhelming, especially because each school has their own like weird instructions. Abby, go ahead. Yes.
I got a question. What is CV?
Great question. Curriculum vitae. It's like the academic version of a resume. It's set up very different than a resume, like physically, the way it's laid out. Not really. I'll show examples. It tends to just be longer and a little bit more verbose than a resume. We'll look at examples later, but if you're applying to graduate programs like PhDs, they'll want a CV and not a resume.
Yes, like usually a resume is like really nicely formatted, and there's the rule of like only have 1 page and things like that, and that's not how it works with a CV. And they don't want to know about necessarily your job at the ice cream parlor or whatever, where that might be higher up on a resume. They want to know more about your research and publications and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll show you guys a little bit more details. And there are examples in the drive, so you can kind of get a sense of like what experiences are important to put on there and like what people don't put on there. So for example, like I did not put lifeguarding on mine, but I did put like working in a clinical setting. So like that's kind of the distinction.
Then there are several questions
I see.
related to, yeah, emailing professors.
Yes. Hopefully we can circle back to that because there are 26 chats that I did not read. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly, when is it too early to email professors?
Okay.
I If there's a professor you're really interested in and you want to know about their current research and they're expecting application, is it worth re-emailing and asking for a meeting with them? Can we introduce ourselves, ask questions, and send our CV, or do we have to wait for them to ask for it?
Oh, yeah. So I lead with my CV first off. I just attach it. I don't wait for them to ask. So absolutely do that. In terms of too early, so I think generally they figure out funding, like whether or not they'll be able to take somebody at the beginning of the fall semester. So if you email them in August, they genuinely won't know. If you email them in September, you have a better chance of them being like, yeah, absolutely, or like, no, I just found out I don't. So that's why I would say wait till September, because you might just waste your time and their time emailing too early. Did I miss other questions? Sorry. No.
Just the one about asking for a meeting.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks for keeping me honest, Abby. I really appreciate you. Asking about a meeting, I feel like they might say no because they're busy, but it's probably worth asking. If you have a simple question like, are you accepting? Then like, don't ask for a meeting because they can, do that in 30 seconds. If you have a longer term question of like, big project ideas and you want to work with them and it's like much more amorphous and you want to talk through it, then you can try. They might say no. I know my advisor at least has like 30 meetings a week, like consistently. That's without taking on extras. And so I think she would probably say no, just based on like my knowledge of her schedule, but don't be offended if they say no, they're probably just really busy. Okay, cool. I'm gonna move on. Feel free to interrupt me. I appreciate you, Abby. Thank you. Okay, so make your accounts early in September. So each, oh, this is really annoying. I don't know if you guys know this yet. Each and every school has their own application site and they're all disorganized and they're all different. So that's really fun. You will need a different username and password for each one. So definitely like make a spreadsheet and store those, because otherwise you're going to like get locked out of your own application, which would be bad. I did that in September so that I could have access to all of the instructions for like the statements of purpose and all this stuff. Like I got that as early as I could. Sometimes they don't open them until like October, but I think most of them open them in the spring, honestly, which you're not behind. It's okay. But yeah, so make a document with all of your account information. And then I made a document with the like specific wording of what they want for the statement of purpose, what they want in the CV, what they want, blah, 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 blah. I just wrote it all down and I like kept it, made me feel a little bit more in control. Okay, so yeah, keep everything organized, save everything. So I ended up reusing a lot of elements from my statement of purpose from one place and a statement of purpose from a different place. So definitely don't like save it as a PDF and you have to like figure out how to grab that back. Like just don't do that to yourself. This worked for me. I worked through one school at a time. I found it really confusing to try to keep in mind all of the different instructions from all of the different places. This just worked well for me. It was also very satisfying every time I submitted an application. It was just like, that was a good benchmark for me. Do what works for you. Pay really close attention to the directions. So they will all have very specific direction. Hopefully, this might be an overselling. They should have very specific directions on the length and the number of words or the number of characters or what specifically they're looking for. Definitely don't defy their directions. That would look bad. Some places are just like, give me a statement of purpose. And in that case, you can totally recycle from a different school. Keep it reasonable. Don't have it be like 20 pages. Just probably go with the guidance from other schools if they don't give you super clear guidance. This is the list that I came up with while I was applying about the elements that like each application packet that I call it should have. And so some schools are going to specifically ask for these elements and other schools aren't. And so I knew that on the schools that like didn't ask for, community engagement, I wanted to shove that in somewhere. I wanted to make sure that came through. And it served me well to come up with a list pretty early, because it was obviously easier to do that on the front end of like shoving things in. So you can feel free to refer to this list or come up with your own list as you're reviewing instructions, because like obviously not every field is going to ask for clinical background. If you're applying to developmental programs, they aren't really, that's not important to them necessarily. So definitely like, make sure it's authentic to the programs you're applying to, but this is the list that I made sure every single packet had. Yeah, okay. And I'll come back to this. So the CV, this is your like place to brag, absolutely brag. Talk about every cool thing you've ever done that is research or clinical related. Here is a list of like the kind of headers, and you can change the headers to fit like your needs a little bit. So like if you only have scholarships and no honors distinctions, like don't put honors and scholarships, just put scholarships. But this is generally what you should have. Some places will say like 2 pages max, and then you can like cut out, you have to cut out sections. So I added some asterisks to the things that I thought were easy to cut out for myself, because I could bring them in later. I could bring that up in my statement of purpose or my diversity statement or whatever. The references, so they're going to get reference letters from your references. So you don't need to throw that on there. That's super easy to cut. Some places like don't want it and they'll say that. I found that really odd. Anyways, so this is a general like list, and then there are lots of examples in our drive of like our current PhD students when they were applying. So definitely check those out. In terms of formatting, there's like a million different places you can look for like suggestions on formatting, and a lot of them are conflicting. So just find one that looks clean and neat and stick to it, and don't overthink it. We're going back to Andy Dwyer here. We're like, whatever you do is great. We're just sticking with it. It looks good, moving on. Okay. So you can find templates online, or you can steal our templates. I don't care. Statement of purpose, that's SOP. Personal statement, diversity statement. Every school is going to have at least one of these. Some schools are going to have all 3. Some are going to have 2. And it gets really confusing between schools because they each have different directions on what they want in these elements. So again, read the instructions really closely, but also like refer back to this slide. The personal statement is much more about you, whereas the statement of purpose is about your research. Now, sometimes like I know University of Minnesota has a research statement, like, okay, what's the statement of purpose if this is the research statement? Like it gets really muddy. So go through the directions, look at their list of what they're looking for and like stick to that. And then go back to that list that I had earlier and make sure that each of those elements is somewhere in there. If you're like doing a diversity statement and a statement of purpose, figure out where you're going to fit in your community engagement, figure out where you're going to fit in your research experiences, like just make it all fit into some of the boxes if you're confused. Hopefully that makes sense. I hope that was coherent. I'm happy to talk about that later. So statement of purpose is a lot easier if you've done this pondering of your research question. It's more of, hopefully, it's like a narrative of how you came to think about that research question, how that became your passion, as well as why graduate school is the right place for you. And so you can talk about your academic experiences, you can talk about your clinical experiences, you can talk about your research experiences, but you don't need to have every single experience on your CV. I jumped around a lot in undergrad in terms of the labs I was in. I only talked about the ones that like cleanly fit into my like story about why I'm interested in XYZ. So definitely don't need to talk about everything. This is your space to like sell yourself and tell, like, make a really good story about why you are ready for graduate school, your experiences have prepared you, and this is why they should accept you. There's also a portion at the end where you really need to tie it back to like them and be like, I'm interested in XYZ. This faculty member is also interested in this. I really like your program's emphasis on blah, blah, blah. And I think my value of this fits in with that. So you need to sell them specifically on you to their program. Make it really clear that you've read like their mission statements, read their faculty bios, and like that you mesh with that. There are tons of examples. It's a lot easier to like read them and kind of feel that flow than it is for me to like describe it to you. So definitely check that out. Trying to think, yeah. Underrepresented students often undersell themselves. So don't undersell yourself. Know that going into this, that this is your place to brag and do it. And your mentors are absolutely, you know, ready and willing to like edit to make sure that you are, you know, bragging enough. We're happy to like tell you where the line is, or, you know, read your stuff and edit it as need be. Okay. One thing I kind of mentioned this with the CV, you can totally get bogged down in like the advice and examples online. Follow the instructions first, and then do something that's like true to you, because there's going to be like, you know, the hamburger, you start with this paragraph and then you do that paragraph, you circle back to that idea. There's lots of advice. So just kind of do what feels good to you as long as you are following instructions. Okay. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. Okay. The diversity statement, slash shoving your personal background into the statement of purpose as relevant. You can briefly talk about your background and how that shapes your research in your statement of purpose. I get lots of questions about how much to self-disclose. That's really specific to you and your comfort level. And that's something, you know, talk to your mentor about or crowdsource on Slack, because there are different ways you can go about self-disclosing about, you know, I identify as XYZ, I've had experiences in this environment, XYZ, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you can overshare and that doesn't look good. Sometimes you can like indicate that maybe you weren't emotionally mature enough, like just in the way you're writing. I'm not accusing anyone of not being emotionally mature. There's a way to go about writing it appropriately. So just kind of have people read it, essentially is what I'm trying to say. That self-disclosure that you might include. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So, and the diversity statement generally is more about like what diverse perspectives you bring to the program and how you can kind of serve the program in that way. And so make sure you tie it back to that. It's not just like your journal. There's a purpose. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm like really struggling with my voice. Here is an example. I think this is Adrian's, or no, this is Andrea's. Kind of diagrams about what elements I'm really losing my voice. She included in the diversity statement. So take a look at that later. Addressing weaknesses can be hard. So if you have a lower GPA or a lower GRE, you can bring that up. You can absolutely like head that off and say, you know, I know this might look bad on paper, but I've grown from this, or this is actually what was going on. You can bring that up, but make sure you have somebody read it to make sure it comes off appropriately. Yeah, acknowledge, provide context, and move on. Okay. So some programs will like cut based on your GRE. And so if your GRE is below a score, they're just gonna like throw your application out, which is really sad. And so there are ways to get around this. And so you can email the faculty member directly. You can talk to the director of the program directly and kind of explain the situation and like, you know, just make sure that they like actually see your stuff. This is for Mariah. She has a little bit more experience in this. And so I think she'd be happy to talk about that. She's been pretty open about talking about how she was able to overcome this in terms of like breaking through that like kind of culling of applications. Okay. Letters of recommendation are so important, and it's kind of frustrating because a lot of times it's out of your control. But your goal is to have 3 different types of letters. Some programs will like explicitly say these types, but this is really like what you're looking for. You want a research oriented, an academic oriented, and a personality oriented. Generally, you would like people to be like PhDs in the field that you want to go into, but sometimes that doesn't happen. Asking for a letter, like the way you go about asking is really important because professors are busy. So give them a lot of notice and give them a lot of relevant material so that they can just like very quickly like zip through and be like, oh yeah, she was here from this year to this year and she did this project and she published on this and blah, blah, blah. So give them all the information up front. One thing that I just uploaded, so it's not linked in here, but I just uploaded it to the folder is like my template for what I gave my letter writers. And the letter writers know to write it to the director of the department. And so you aren't having them like say, dear Dr., the faculty member you're applying to. They're writing it to the director of the department. They know this, but you should also know this. And so I supplied the title, the name of the department, the school, the faculty members I was interested in applying in, kind of generally what I wanted to do in graduate school in terms of like, if I was more research or clinically focused, that sort of deal. One thing that this just jogged my memory. So at least in clinical psych, I'm assuming developmental and other programs as well, each program has its own really unique name. So I'm in the clinical science and psychopathology research program, CSPR, whatever. And so if I said, hi, University of Minnesota, I would like to apply to the clinical program, they're going to be like, no, it's the clinical science and psychopathology, so make sure you have that program like written out precisely. It just looks better. And it's bad if you use like one from a different school for if you use the wrong one, it looks bad. So that's something to keep an eye on. Don't forget to advocate for yourself. Like I said, professors are really busy and sometimes they like totally forget. So just keep on them. This is like a good time for you to advocate, like, practice advocating, hopefully with people that you know and trust. We can talk a little bit more about like what to do if you don't have these clean letter writers identified. But I think that's generally like a really personal like situation. So that would be a good conversation to have with your mentor. Okay. So you guys can read this later. Rich Lee is director of counseling at U of M. He's wonderful. So this is his Twitter thread on a strong application. These two, so this is my mentor and this is a different mentor in our department. Last year, they recorded interviews or conversations about what they look for in applications. So feel free to peruse those. The videos are linked here. They're also in the drive. I was having trouble with the links. So if the links don't work, they're in the drive. I pinky swear. And I'm happy to like find them for people if you can't find them. There are lots of suggestions online like about what's important, but feel free to look through these. I just have some lists to look at. And then another thing that kind of comes up concurrently with this application process is applying to fellowships. Andrea, another one of our lead mentors, will be hosting a session explicitly on this. So she's won the Ford Fellowship and NSF, which is like crazy impressive. She's one of my best friends, so I will always brag about how impressive she is. But yeah, so definitely check that out if that's something you are interested in September. She hasn't picked a date, but I think it'll be beginning of September. Okay, one last thing before we move on. So this is a really stressful process. I benefited greatly from having friends who were doing the exact same thing as me at the same time. We read each other's material, we checked in, we made sure we were sane. It's just know that you are not alone and how stressful this is, because it feels like the rest of your life is like hanging in the balance and you need to do everything correctly. And oh my gosh, what if you don't get in? And it's just like, you can get really, really in your head. There's so many decision points and there's so many like, if only I had done this, I would have gotten an interview. Don't do that to yourself. It's much easier for me to say, don't do that to yourself, but I'm saying it, don't do that to yourself. Don't go down those rabbit holes. Don't allow yourself to ruminate, because this can be really stressful. Talk to your support systems. I'm assuming, at least this is my experience, a lot of your like external support systems may not have any idea what the heck you're doing. Like, what is a PhD? Why are you spending all this time and money on applications? try to loop them in. It's helpful. My parents were nice about it. I don't know. Ask your mentors for help editing materials. I meant NPSP mentors, but also your like, if you have a research mentor presently or like an academic mentor, they can be really helpful, especially if they've been involved in the like application process. You guys already have a really great Slack, which I love. So thank you for having a Slack. Please lean on each other. Again, this can be stressful. Yeah, hopefully you guys can maybe workshop some materials together. If not, talk to your mentor. I was really organized. That's how I managed my stress. And so I set aside Saturday mornings. That was my application time. I had a nice ritual. It like really put me in the right headspace. And I really stuck to that. And I found that really helpful. Do what works for you. And now is a great time to come up with a repertoire of good stress management skills, because once you get into graduate school, you're going to be relying on those again. So, practice good habits. Okay, I'm done talking for now. Thank you all for sitting here and listening to me for so long. Hopefully we can work through some of your questions now. So we have Abby, Karina, Gianna, and Parabine. Did I say that right? Okay, cool. I don't think I can pin you guys, but you are one of the few, you guys are the few with your cameras on. So that works out. Okay. Does anyone want to pop on with questions, or should we just work through the chat? Okay. Did you have a question? Did you have a question?
Asking me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. When you spoke about the CV, I want to ask what was the